Hello and welcome to another edition of Law and Democracy, a podcast of the election law program at The Ohio State University. I am Steve Huffner. I'm the Deputy Director of the election law program here at OSU. And today I'm delighted to have as part of our podcast team, Ned Foley, our director, Tony Goggin, a visiting professor with us at OSU this fall, and Terry Enns, a senior fellow of the election law program. And as the election grows closer, there remains no shortage of things we might talk about. Been a lot of attention this week on some ways in which dollars are flowing into the campaign. Tony, tell us what we're going to talk about first.
That's right, Steve. Our first topic today is the Elon Musk Sweepstakes. The news the last day or so has been filled with stories about Elon Musk's petition that he is circulating in Battleground States that asks voters to pledge to support the First and Second Amendments. But his petition is limited to individuals who are registered to vote. And as part of signing the petition, individual signers are eligible to receive or to participate in a sweepstakes whereby they can receive a $1 million prize. And it's reported this afternoon that three registered voters have received the $1 million prize that Elon Musk has attached to the pro First and Second Amendment petition. And so the question is the Musk sweepstakes, are they legal, or is this a violation of the federal prohibition on paying voters to register to vote?
As I understand it, the three who've received $1 million each received them one each day, starting Sunday. Somebody got the million on Sunday, and someone got it yesterday, and a third person got it today. Musk has proposed to continue giving out $1 million a day between now and election day. So what is the underlying law here, right? There's a federal law that people are talking about. There may be some state laws in some states as well, although it's really the federal law that people have been focusing on.
Right, there's this longstanding federal prohibition on paying individuals to register or to vote. And the idea, of course, is to battle or to prevent the risk that individuals would be bribed to vote a certain way. But the question here is whether a sweepstakes that's limited exclusively to individuals who have registered to vote runs afoul of that federal law.
And I'm not looking at the text of the law myself, but I think the law is written in such a way that by its terms, it covers some incentivizing with the intent to encourage people to register to vote. So there's a little bit of both squishiness there in that it may not be that the activity has to expressly be conditioned on persons registering, as long as the reason that the activity is occurring is with the intent to promote more registration to vote. But of course, there's an inverse to that, which is proving intent is incredibly difficult. So that wrinkle of the federal law kind of cuts both ways. It makes it easier to argue that some kinds of activity may run afoul of the law, but on the other hand, it makes it harder to prove that that's what the activity was about, I think.
And I certainly think one of the ironies here is that in the big picture, there are lots of different encouragements that people get to register to vote. Certainly in professional sporting events, you see the pro sports leagues encouraging voters to register. You see celebrities encouraging it. What makes this different is the monetary angle, the idea that there's a financial reward if you register to vote, keeping in mind, even with a person receiving this award every day, it's still a tiny percentage of registered voters in the Battleground States who would ever win this award. But that is obviously not an element, or it is not necessary to establish a large number of people were paid to vote. You just have to establish presumably one case of it.
But correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, this isn't being structured as, if you register, I will pay you X dollars, or even I will give you a lottery ticket that you can enter the lottery. This is if you are a registered voter, you can enter the lottery. So, I, I am worried about squishiness in a criminal law. And let me be clear, I don't like what Musk is doing here. It seems nefarious and insidious, even if it's not illegal. But I tend to think the criminal laws should be, strictly construed. That's a principle, the rule of lenity, I think it's called. Um, and so if we can imagine circumstances that would not run afoul of this law, where is this example on the spectrum is what I'm struggling with.
Right, and that's certainly my understanding as well, Ned, that the sweepstakes are limited to individuals who are already registered to vote. But then I presume the argument that this is illegal is predicated on the idea that it's encouraging people to register to vote to be eligible for the sweepstakes.
And of course, in most of these states, it's now too late to register for this election. If you're not already registered, it's past the registration deadline in most places. But that wouldn't prevent somebody from going ahead and register, someone who's not yet registered, from going ahead and registering, even though that registration would not allow them to vote in 2 weeks. But it would make them eligible for this lottery.
I thought the lottery ended, at least the Pennsylvania one ended on the date the registration closed, and that was supposedly evidence for intent, that it was tied to being an incentive. So I'm a little bit confused in my own mind about it. Are the facts identical in all of the swing states, or does it vary a little bit from state to state?
I think they're not. The AP story I'm looking at right now, Ned, says that the deadlines to register to vote in time for election day have already passed in 4 of the states: Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So that's an additional complication here, that in some states, people still do have time to register in some of these battleground states, but apparently not in Pennsylvania.
But yeah, you've raised an interesting question, which is, do the details of this lottery offer make more apparent that it is in fact an intent behind this measure to get people to register to vote? And if in fact, which states you can be eligible for this $1 million by which date vary depending on that state's registration deadline, that does lend itself to an argument that the purpose behind it is to encourage people to register, which starts to look like it's contrary to the federal law.
I have seen some analysts who say, yeah, this is all not about getting people to register at all. It's actually about collecting a nice database of people who signed the petition and give contact information for get out the vote purposes over the next couple of early vote and election day. So that it's the incentive is actually to get people to fork over enough information that they can be contacted to make sure that they go vote. And the group of people would be likely, First and Second Amendment supporters might be a group. Well, it's kind of an interesting combination, isn't it? First Amendment and Second Amendment. It's harder to say who they would be likely to vote for, but I've seen some.
And if that's demonstrably the intent behind this lottery, that seems perfectly legal.
Right.
An incentive to create get out the vote list.
What if Musk wasn't paying people to sign the petition and limiting eligibility to sign the petition to registered voters. But what if he was paying people to go door to door canvassing, and either direct, cash payments, or a lottery ticket, for $1 million if you're willing to go door to door canvassing on behalf, even explicitly on behalf of Trump, but limited eligibility of the canvassers to people who were registered, saying, I want my pool of canvassers to people who are committed to the political process, and that's, a way of showing that you're committed. It's committed to the process. So only if you're registered in the state will I pay you to go door to door to canvass.
Yeah,
That sort of raises the question of whether the reason for the registration requirement in that hypothetical is for the reason you described, Ned, which is to limit the people who are engaged in this activity to people who themselves are in a fundamental sense connected to the activity because they can vote, or whether the intent can be proven to be instead to encourage people to register through an incentive. And as Tony said, there are all kinds of really valuable efforts to encourage people to register to vote. The question isn't whether encouraging people to register is a problem, it's whether providing a financial incentive for them to register is a problem under the law. And as Ned, you said, it's not an easy thing to try to apply a criminal law, and not even the right thing to try to apply a criminal law in a circumstance that's kind of iffy. But that's what the statute, I think, seems to capture, is something that is intended to provide financial payment to encourage people to register. Your hypothetical, as you described it, isn't in that category, but the question for a prosecutor or a jury, if it got there, would be, what is the real intent behind it? Now, yeah,
in
go
some
ahead.
ways, this is almost the inevitable next step in the debate over money in politics, though in a way it's harkening back to the 19th century era of vote buying. But as we all know, 14 years ago, Citizens United dominated national discussion over the role of money in politics. And through most of the 2010s, the issue of large campaign large contributions to super PACs, resulting in a election system in which rich people had a larger voice than everybody else, was of great concern in public discourse. Now, it strikes me interestingly, the last two election cycles, there really hasn't been that much discussion about the influence of super PACs. In part, I think that's because the overall level of spending has been such that both parties have been quite competitive at getting their message out. And some of the concerns that Republicans would dominate campaign fundraising in the post-Citizens United era did not materialize. But now here in the 2020s, in an era where 10,000 votes might decide the outcome of the presidential election, if it comes down to a single state, as we discussed in the past, potentially a scheme to, not that I'm saying that's what this is, but potentially a scheme to pay people to register to vote could reach more than 10,000 people or more than 20,000 people, the number you would need to actually win the state in a presidential election. So again, in some ways, I think this is so troubling, not so much for what it actually represents, but for what it could represent in the future.
Well, that actually raises, I think, a philosophical question in my mind about why we think that this kind of thing is pernicious. And I think we talked about in a previous episode how, in my mind, it's important to me to distinguish, for example, foreign interference or any interference that denies a citizen the right to vote or negates voter choice on one hand, versus things that influence voters' choice on the other. And a lot of foreign messaging, disinformation, while again nefarious and insidious, doesn't negate voter choice. It potentially influences voter choice. And in fact, there was in the last 24 hours or so, there's reports of Russian smear disinformation against the Democratic vice presidential candidate. I think, I can't remember whether it was alleging that he had an affair or something like that. Totally fabricated, totally made up. Let's just hypothesize that it makes a difference in terms of dissuades some people voting for the ticket. Seems unlikely, but just let's assume that, and assume that you can prove that enough voters are dissuaded. There's no cause of action that I'm aware of in any of the 50 states in the United States that said you could void the outcome because you've proven that voters were influenced by those kinds of deliberate lies about a candidate's personal life. And I think that there's a wide consensus among election law scholars, tell me if I'm wrong, that's correct. We wouldn't want judges to be able to invalidate a result even upon compelling proof that that was outcome determinative, because we think it's up to the voter to make up their mind why they vote the way they do. Yet, going back to the 19th century, it has been thought to be an actionable kind of an election fraud to buy votes. And if you can prove that not only is it a criminal crime, but if you can prove that enough people were paid, for their vote, and that number is, and again, these are more 19th century cases, is greater than the margin of victory, you can void an election because of vote buying. And is that because we believe that the decision to accept the financial payment it actually negates voter choice in a way that being persuaded by lies doesn't? I mean, it doesn't quite negate voter choice then, for example, a hurricane that prevented voters from actually going to the polls would, genuinely negate voter choice. A voter who casts a ballot in accordance with the wishes of the person who gave them the financial payment is sort of making arguably a voluntary decision to take the money and cast the ballot in exchange for the money. But we think of it as a polluted or tainted voter choice that's different from disinformation. Or am I wrong about that? To me, there's a interesting philosophical question underlying what I think is a pretty sharp distinction in our legal system between these two kinds of electoral interferences.
Yeah, I agree, Ned. It is an interesting distinction. When you can look at it in the context of a typical election, voters usually vote their pocketbook. And, James Carville famously said it's the economy, stupid. And we celebrate that, the idea that voters make choices based on what's in their best interests. But we draw the line at the idea of someone actually paying you directly rather than cutting your taxes to thank you for voting for them. If they pay you even a relatively small amount of money, that's a felony, and that undermines the sanctity of our democracy, it undermines the integrity of the election. I wonder if in the 19th century context, I think the underlying concern was that oligarchs who really didn't have anything positive to offer the electorate would buy off the electorate, use the massive fortunes of the Gilded Age to undermine democracy in a way that they wouldn't be able to do if they were purely appealing to the electorate based on policy issues. And so I suspect that's the underlying basis for why we still are so alarmed by efforts to pay people to register or pay people to vote, even when there's not proof that the voter was expected to vote a certain way. We are so determined to prevent that risk of vote buying itself that simply paying someone to register to vote is a felony. And so but philosophically, I can't explain necessarily the distinction that you laid out, a rationale behind it beyond the underlying policy concern.
And you mentioned campaign finance laws and campaign, Citizens United and so forth. Because of the research that I've done, I'm aware of a U.S. Senate election in the 1920s where the winning candidate was found by his election was challenged in the United States Senate because the Senate can control the returns and elections of its own members on the grounds that this was before our modern era of campaign finance laws, but that he spent so much money not to buy votes directly, but to flood, well, it wasn't airwaves because I think it was maybe there was some radio advertising, but it was mostly print advertising. But the concept of campaign advertising at the time was super saturated by this wealthy money that was thought to violate an early federal campaign finance law. And there was an argument in the Senate that that was enough of a pollution of the integrity of the election that they should void the result. If my memory serves, that argument failed, but it was a pretty powerful argument made by a lot of prominent senators during the progressive era. And I'm aware of at least one case, I think it's from Minnesota, an old case where an election was voided because the winning candidate had engaged in campaign finance violations under state law. But we don't really think that federal elections should be voided. I mean, the allegations against Trump in terms of, the payment of money, to Stormy Daniels was arguably a campaign finance violation, and we could talk endlessly about that if we, but most people don't, to my mind, don't think that that would have been grounds for, for saying that his victory wasn't a valid victory because the voters voted for him, right? I mean, even if it was a campaign finance violation, it doesn't negate the validity of the votes themselves. So I think there's some conflicting notions and maybe even conflicting precedents within our overall legal system on these questions.
I suppose one way of thinking about this is whether the federal statute at issue in connection with this lottery arrangement is itself an overbroad response to the real problem, which is paying somebody to vote in a particular way, or paying someone to register because that person then will vote in a particular way, which harks back to the historical problems of outright vote buying, versus an innocuous benefit to somebody, financial benefit, to encourage them to be a more active participant in the democratic process and get them registered and get them to the polls without regard to which candidates they're going to support. And obviously we've got a federal statute in place that makes it a federal crime to pay someone to vote or to pay someone to register to vote in order to avoid the outright vote buying, but it prohibits much more than that. And I suppose in some sense that's what you're hinting, or that's what you're getting at too, Ned, that if it's not outright telling the voter or an arrangement with the voter to vote in a particular way, the voter still has the choice to make independently.
I mean, I am worried about so-called ballot selfies. That to me, that is the biggest risk over the last decade or so. I'm not aware of any major scandal that's developed. But we do have we are living in the neo-Gilded Age, with neo-oligarchs, of which Elon Musk is arguably an example. And we're there to develop a circumstance in which it became apparent that that individuals were being paid in exchange for voting the correct way, and that was being verified, by sending, I mean, Musk owns X, and if the understanding is you post your ballot selfie on X and you get rewarded for that, that to me definitely crosses the line.
Yeah, that's unquestionably problematic from the standpoint of vote buying. So,
Which makes it all the more remarkable to me that there are courts that have held that laws banning ballot selfies are a violation of the First Amendment, often citing to the fact that there isn't a history of vote buying in that state, which to me seems like a very short-sighted way of approaching a law that's intended to prevent a problem from occurring rather than being justified only if there was a pre-existing problem. So yeah, Ned, I think the ballot selfie issue is intimately connected to this issue in the background of the controversy over paying people to register to vote. It's the first stage in something that could become a really big issue in 2 years, 4 years, 8 years down the road. And also as technology changes and becomes easier and easier to stealthily take pictures, which today I think ballot election officials can see if something strange is going on where voters are consistently coming in taking ballot selfies. But it's easy to imagine a few years down the road where there'll be no way to detect if someone is surreptitiously taking pictures of ballot selfies. So yeah, I think that ballot selfie issue is looming larger and larger as a consequence of things like the Elon Musk sweepstakes.
I suppose that it's possible that this particular moment and this particular activity could give rise to post-election reflection and discussion about what really we want our law to say. And that seems to me to be maybe the best result, is to think about it a little more carefully than to try and sort it out on the fly right now. And in particular, given that it could well be that Musk is deliberately sort of testing the limits here or pressing the envelope and would like nothing more than to be the poster child in a prosecution that he says is a politically motivated prosecution around a statute that is not particularly clear whether it covers this. And I was looking again, I mean, I look now at the actual language of the statute, and we'll just clarify that the statute itself makes it illegal to pay someone to register to vote. But the question of whether the reason for the payment is to get them to register to vote is not captured in the terms of the statute. That question of the intent behind the payment just becomes a question for the trier of fact to decide. Was the payment made to get the person to register to vote or not? And that's a very hard thing to prove. And in a circumstance in which other reasons could be offered up, when the payment is specifically tied to the requirement that you sign a petition, not tied to a requirement that you register, just that you be registered when you sign the petition. So anyway, now I'm repeating things, but a prosecution on these facts could make Musk very happy.
Yeah, certainly the controversy that's surrounding this at a certain level has achieved, I think, the goal, which is to drive voter turnout. As Terry said before, it's, maybe in this context, there is no such thing as bad publicity. Particularly, I wonder if he sought legal counsel in advance. I suspect he did. He certainly can afford it. And it's an amazing era we're living in where, depending on the outcome of the presidency, that this law is going to be interpreted potentially very differently by which Justice Department it is in 2025, which I find very disconcerting as well. It's it's extraordinary because at a certain level, this is a kind of absurd thing, but it opens so many doors to bad outcomes, bad future outcomes. It's very, very troubling, even as at a certain level, it's farcical.
I wonder if it'll backfire to any extent. So far I haven't seen the Harris campaign try to make a campaign issue out of, plutocrats trying to steal democracy. Maybe it's out there and I haven't seen it, but I would have thought the idea of having Elon Musk, even if it's not factually true that he's able really to buy Trump's victory, I would think Americans, regardless of political persuasion, would really not like the idea that the sovereignty of democracy does not belong to them, but belongs, to the richest person in the world. I'm overstating the point, but insofar as I do think, Tony, you're right, that there probably will be some pro-Trump turnout effect from the publicity surrounding this, which again, in a First Amendment world is, people can decide to do what they decide to do. But it's also possible that the exercise of voter persuasion runs in two directions with respect to this activity, maybe.
Possibly. I mean, I'm a little less prone to think that very many voters who aren't already um, opposed to Trump and opposed to some of what Musk himself is doing are going to be influenced in that way. Instead, I think there's just a very large portion of America that likes lotteries in the first place, and will see this as just another way to take a chance on getting some free money.
Yeah, it is an amazing part of our national character. It dates back to the 18th century. Lotteries were popular. Famous figures in American history, presidents were involved in lotteries earlier in their careers. I wonder, on the broader issue of turnout, the early indications are that the Republicans really have embraced early voting. And it's an open question whether that will cannibalize election day turnout. But their early indications are we are going to see, once again, a historic level of turnout. Whether it will exceed the roughly 158 million people who voted in 2020 remains to be seen. But to the extent that voter turnout's a good thing, and I think it is a good thing, certainly I don't want to see a billionaire influencing the election in a toxic or poisonous or corrupting way. But I do think it is really good to see so much emphasis on getting out and voting in 2024. And there's so many fears about the future of our democracy, but I take heart from the fact that turnout levels are at historic highs. And that's a sign that people still see elections as important. They still see our democratic process as one that does have an impact for good or for bad, depending on who wins. And I think in the big picture, that's something that's reassuring. If we saw voters simply refusing to participate in the system, if we saw turnout rates crash well below 50%, that would concern me more than what we're seeing right now, which is a controversy over whether a particular get off the vote method is legal or not. I am glad to see such a high level participation in early voting by Republicans and so much interest in the whole question of registering to vote.
And if my memory serves, this isn't the first idea of using lottery tickets as a turnout inducement. My recollection is that the congressional scholar Norm Ornstein, about a decade or so ago, proposed something like this in an op-ed. Now, it wasn't involving Elon Musk supplying the money, and I haven't seen that op-ed for a long time. And my recollection is it was, the government was going to
Public funding, yeah,
public
public funding.
funding, right? So, in instead of just getting an I vote sticker when you when you vote, the government hands you a lottery ticket. So, it's been thought to be a pro-democracy kind of advice if it's, genuinely neutral as to the candidates involved and the parties involved, and it's just trying to boost your civic participation, as you say, Tony. Because Musk is not the government, and because he's endorsed one candidate, this is seen as one-sided in a way that I don't think Norm Ornstein's proposal was.
Yeah, and that's why the statute prohibits this and doesn't simply prohibit paying a person for a particular vote. And it is arguably different if it's the government saying, here's the way in which voting will occur, and we really would like to have broader participation, so everyone who votes gets an I voted sticker and a lottery ticket. And, that's an alternative. Australia has made voting mandatory as a way of increasing turnout. The idea of mandatory voting now and then gets discussed in the United States, and that discussion usually ends pretty quickly because of a certain degree of independence and a sense that the government shouldn't be forcing people to vote. So a government-sponsored lottery is a different alternative, and that could be adopted without the concerns, or at least arguably without the same level of concern that is behind the statute that's now at issue. But all of this does raise questions now about what this election's turnout is going to look like, Tony, and I appreciated your reflection there. When I think about the potential difference between this election and the 2020 election, 2020, of course, seeing a dramatic increase in mail-in voting, largely because of the pandemic, and with resistance to that came especially from the Trump campaign in 2020, that this year, this election, with some inconsistency on this point, the Trump campaign has been encouraging its supporters to take advantage of really all the voting methods that are available. And will that lead to reduction over time in some of the hostility towards certain features of mail-in voting? I'm thinking of drop boxes, for instance, which continue to surface in the news from time to time. A controversy about the extent to which drop boxes should be available for people who are voting a mail-in ballot to return their ballot without actually putting it in the postal system and instead taking it to an authorized receptacle somewhere. And we've seen in many places now for several years efforts to really narrow or limit the degree to which those drop boxes are available for reasons that really seem not to be empirically justified. I mean, the arguments are that drop boxes make mail-in voting less secure. The drop boxes can be penetrated in some fashion, but the security measures in place for drop boxes are quite robust, and we have no incidents of serious abuse or fraud associated with the drop boxes. And so if both major parties are increasingly excited about being able to lock in some of their supporters' votes in an earlier fashion through mail-in voting, will we see drop boxes, for instance, become more accepted and more widely, and in more locations, kind of a thing?
Maybe in part, this ordeal we've been going through as a democracy the last decade is a giant stress test of the system. And when both sides win at different times under a system of early voting and no excuse absentee voting and widespread availability of drop boxes, maybe we needed this experience for the country to understand that our system is secure. At a certain level, you need someone to say it's not secure for the issue to be addressed or understood by the public, to see the debate. And it's not the kind of thing that can be resolved through one election. I think it does take a series of elections before the country as a whole collectively can reach a conclusion about whether or not our election system is secure. And the fact that it's been supporters of one party who've been particularly fearful of new voting methods, that this has been the Republican Party, and the fact that Trump lost in 2020, I think really did undermine Republican confidence in the security of mail-in ballots. But if Trump wins in 2024, I suspect, with such a large percentage of the ballots now cast by Republicans coming in by mail-in ballots, I bet there will be an increased level of Republican confidence in mail-in ballots. And it may be Trump, won't be Trump, maybe in 2024 or 2028, it'll be a Republican who wins in that kind of in political environment in which Republicans are actively taking advantage of a greater number of opportunities to vote. Maybe it would take that, but I guess my underlying sense is I do have optimism that we will be able to work through this when both sides are able to win under the same conditions. And that takes multiple election cycles, because obviously both parties can't win during the same election. But I do have optimism that we're going to be able to work through this.
Well, that's a hopeful note. I mean, Ned sounded a hopeful note earlier about the possibility that a lot of Americans might not like the idea that the world's richest person was putting a thumb on the scales of the election. And I was a little less hopeful about that point. But I'll take your hope, Tony, that maybe with a couple of cycles, people will return to a state of respect for the electoral systems that are in place, which are really quite robust and functioning well. And the election officials who undertake to perform those processes or deserve our appreciation rather than some of the abuse that they've been receiving. I'll just say that, to a certain extent, this notion that we may need to wait several cycles to see this is not necessarily true. And it's one of the ironies of the claim of a stolen election in 2020 was those claims were being made by many elected officials who themselves were elected in that same election and nonetheless chose to claim that the election was riddled with fraud because they didn't like the outcome of just one race. But I take your point that over time we may get closer to a healthier position again.
Let's hope so. We have to calm down the anxiety. I mean, just the degree of agitation over the voting process is worrisome to me, and we have to have a mindset that, yes, like Reagan said, trust but verify, right? I mean, you need verification of the system, but there are processes in place to make sure that the outputs, the ballots are counted accurately and correctly, and so we have valid results. And if we can't accept that there are valid results despite our own candidate losing, we're in real trouble.
Yeah, very much. Well, maybe we should turn to a trivia question before we run out of time today. Tony?
Absolutely, Steve. Our trivia question from last week was which major American figure other than George Washington lost his first race for office because of his refusal to treat the voters? And the answer is James Madison. George Washington in 1755 had refused to treat the voters with alcohol during his Virginia House of Burgesses race. So sort of a tactic that goes way beyond what Elon Musk has been engaged in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. George Washington refused to do that. He lost in 1758, his first campaign. He paid for over 100 gallons of alcohol for the voters, and he won. Well, the exact same thing happened to James Madison. He, in his first race for the Virginia legislature after independence, he refused to pay for alcohol to be provided to the voters because he thought that was inconsistent with the small r Republican concept of virtue, and he lost. In fact, he was running against a tavern owner, which made him a particularly poor election to choose to refuse to pay for alcohol for the electorate. Noah Feldman's book that on James Madison describes this incident really fantastic. I actually own the book. It's just in my office at home, not here, at my current office. Otherwise, I would show the jacket cover of his excellent book on James Madison. Our trivia question for next week.
Can I interrupt for a second? I mean,
Please.
I love these stories about these early campaigns, early in our country's history and even pre-history. I mean, they're interesting partly because they show how times have changed in terms of what we do expect or tolerate with respect to incentivizing voters. But I also love just the raw scale of this retail politics where it was 100 gallons of beer was what it took. It's not $1 million a day. It was just, going to the local tavern for a few nights kind of a scale. That's just so interesting to compare with today. Sorry to interrupt our next.
No, it's so true. There is a timelessness to it as well. So often they say, is this a candidate you'd want to have a beer with? They're asking the same thing in the 1750s, literally.
Say yes if the candidate is buying, right?
Right. Absolutely. Well, today's trivia question actually relates to some history that Donald Trump has made. Donald Trump is, of course, the Republican nominee for president. He has been the Republican Party's nominee for president 3 times, which distinguishes him historically. It is very rare for anyone to win a major party's nomination 3 times. Of course, in part, that's because we have the 22nd Amendment and a 2-term limit for president. But because Donald Trump lost in 2020, he is eligible to serve another term as president. So the trivia question is, who were I had to write it down to make sure I have the number right. Who were the 7 other candidates in history, major party nominees in history, who won the nomination of their party for president 3 times or more? This goes back to the 1790s through Donald Trump. We've had 7 other cases of individuals who won a major party nomination for president 3 or more times. Who were those 7?
Can I ask one hint or clarification?
Yes.
Does that number 7 include FDR?
Yes, it does. He
Okay.
of course, yes, he
I
is
mean,
one.
obviously he did.
He got 3 or more is the key. He's got 4. In fact, he was on the ticket 5 times because he was the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party in 1920. But this trivia question is just asking for individuals who received the presidential nomination of a major party.
So FDR is sort of a giveaway, and then there are 6 more.
That's right. Exactly right.
Great.
All right. Well, we will share the answer, those other 6, in our next episode. And I'll look forward to that. And I've been glad to be with all of you today. Thanks for joining us.